I'm Tom Kennedy and welcome to Uncensored Stories. Today we're here to talk about the current situation in Colombia with Charo. Thank you very much for joining us, Charo.
Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon for everyone, and thank you for opening up this channel. It's very, very important that people know, understand what is going on in Colombia. Thank you.
Definitely. Can you start off by just talking briefly on your experience working in human rights, especially in Colombia?
Okay. I'm a member of the Black Communities Process in Colombia. This is an organization that was built in 1993 after the process of Black people participation in the amendment of the Constitution in 1991. So this is an organization that is nationwide, and we are focused mainly on the defense and promotion of collective rights of Black Afro-Descendant people against racial discrimination and injustice, and also violence against Black Afro-Descendant women. So most of my work has been focused on these three elements, particularly defending the rights of Black Afro-Descendant people and women in this country, which has been severely impacted by violence and the effects of the internal armed conflict, but also the war that lately, in the since 2000 mostly, where paramilitary groups appear in the country, has been exacerbated in our territories. So I'm focused on that. I do some international work also in representation of the Black Communities Process. I was part of our influence on the Peace Accord to make sure that collective rights of indigenous and Afro-Descendant people will be taken into account. For that, we managed to have an ethnic chapter within this Peace Accord. So I'm part also of the group that follows up. It's a high-level body, ethnic body that follows up the implementation of the Peace Accord and this ethnic chapter. And in terms of Black Afro-Descendant women, I have been coordinating reports to make visible violence against Black Afro-Descendant women, but also to understand what this violence means, because it's not just gender-based. When we talk about gender-based violence, it's not just sexual violence or physical harm to Black Afro-Descendant women. There are many different elements that impact the lives of Black women, and we want people to understand what violence means for Black Afro-Descendant women in this context of economic and neoliberal policies that particularly this government want to impose.
Awesome, and we'll definitely get back to those issues later on in our discussion. But let's get into things at the moment. Can you explain what's going on in Colombia? What sparked the current protest?
Okay, well, Colombia has been on a national strike since May 28. This is a formal strike. However, there have been different mobilizations from different sectors, women, youth, indigenous, Afro-descendants, economic sector, labor, health. In the last couple of years, and we had another strike in 2019, because violence, economic policies, all the impact of COVID has been really impacting the lives of poor, disenfranchised people, mostly of them women and youth. So right now, since May 28, Colombia nationally has been on a strike. This has been severely repressed by the Ivan Duque's government. The specialized force, SMAT, has been shooting people. So we have over 1,700 people or cases of reported. We have a big number of people killed.
Sorry, 1,700 cases of what reported?
Of violence reported.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So separate cases, 1,700 separate cases.
In the whole country, this is what has been reported on the ground. If you go to the official numbers, there is nothing like this. But on the ground, human rights groups, the organizers, and people have been recalling, and this is what the official numbers from the organizers of the strike are being published. 1,700 cases. Let me find the specific numbers, but there is yeah, 1,180 detentions, 37 killings, people who was killed by police. 28 of those happened in Cali, the city of Cali. I have to say that most of this is Black Afro-Descendant people from very impoverished neighborhoods. 31 people have suffered mutilation of their eyes, have suffered injuries that made them lose their eyes. 31 people. 15 sexual aggressions were reported. 10 raids in the different cities, 8 of them fully illegal. And we have 42 people disappeared, many of them from Cali.
So this seems to be a common fear at the moment, is people disappearing, right? So can you talk to us a bit about this fear and circumstances of people disappearing?
Right. Well, different ways. So people leave to the demonstration and there's no returning. So we have receiving constantly these messages like, my son left to the demonstration and I haven't heard from him. My daughter left and I haven't heard from him. So what happens is that there are different circumstances. For instance, we have reported 6 people that were injured and were actually dead, but were attended by the health groups that were on the strike points, attending them, and police came and picked them up, and we don't know where they are. So this is one way of people disappearing. Police pick up the bodies, people pick up injured people, have picked up people, arrested people, and at this point, we don't know what is happening with them. The different human rights groups from the organizers and from organizations have been following up police stations and talking to authorities and Fiscalia. And there are no reports of these people. They are not registered on the official list, but human rights groups have them listed. For instance, here in Cali, a big number of people, and I don't know how, some of them were found, but many of them haven't. Some of those 28 that I mentioned. And one of the shootings and one of the holding points of the strike in the north of Cali, when the police start shooting and bombing, people start running to the sugarcane plantations. This is, Cali in the north area in many parts is surrounded by sugarcane plantations. So people was running too high, and some of that people haven't returned. So that's mostly the situation. Raids the people that have been detained, people that have been injured or go to hospitals or have been picked up from the streets injured or dead, that we don't have reports of where is it.
And so you're mentioning the police using live rounds, opening fire against protesters. Are the protesters that the police are shooting, are they armed at all?
The protesters? No. And if you see and this is the thing, if you see the pictures, one of the things that differs from 2019, for instance, to 2021, the national strike on that point and now, is that it has been an enormous effort to keep it peacefully. So you see people armed with drums and with what are these pitos and trumpets, you know, and music and their palms and these kind of things. And then police using guns, not even gas, not even these other guns that they use with rubber bullets, guns. Helicopters, shooting from the helicopters in cities like Buga and here in the Valle del Cauca department and other cities. And the evidence is there because they kill people. Is not because, you know, what happened in 2019, some of the people that was shot with these, what is that, painting, bombs,
paintball gun,
right? That they were shot in the head, and then, you know, the injuries. No, real bullets. I mean, real bullets. When people is shot and you can see it, right? And also there is proof. There are numerous videos, fortunately, showing how from police stations people dressed on civil clothes are coming out looking like demonstrators, and then there are videos that show that they are talking to the police, that they come from these police stations, and they are later on, you know, with no guns, but rocks and metal. What is that metal things?
like a pole, a baton.
Poles in the stuff, right? And then they are generating this violence. We have, and the organizers of the strike have information on how people, you know, street homeless people and that have been paid to mobilize in some gangs, young gangs, have been paid to create chaos. And initially, that's what happened. They were creating this chaos, throwing rocks, incinerating buildings, or just starting fires in different places. And it has been proved that all these have been motivated, that this is a strategy of police and SMAT to create a state of commotion or emergency state, which is something that this government is looking for because it's very interested on becoming a militarized government.
I'd like to talk about two things. So firstly, the sort of specific policy that kicked off the recent protests. I think there was something with a proposed tax reform. But then also I want to talk about whether that is sort of just a wider frustration against the current government.
Yes. Well, yeah. The tax reform that the Duque's government was proposing, President Duque was proposing now was what ignite the whole situation, right? But this has been like a boiling pot for quite some time. And since 2016, a little bit before the peace accord was signed, violence in different territories increased exponentially. So in the last 3 years, violence, Colombia has become one of the main countries with attacks to human rights defenders and social leaders. 50% of the global attacks to social leaders come from Colombia. The violence against women in the last 3 years here in Colombia has increased 20%. And Black territories, and I would like to talk about that a little bit later, and specifically, this situation has increased 90% of the crimes against Afro-Descendant and Black communities are in areas of mining and energy interest. So in the context of this tremendous violence, we are with a government elected in 2018 that is completely opposed and did his campaign based on opposition to the peace accord. And once he took office, then we see this increasing violence in the territories against FARC, demobilized people, against social leaders, and in Black and indigenous territories, and all linked to economic neoliberal policies that he wants to impose. So to carry out these policies and sustain a militarized country, Duque brought in 2019 the first tax reform that the results of that tax reform is 19 billion pesos and tax havens for private sector, the economic private sector, 32 billion pesos in revenue for banks. Meanwhile, we were facing, and what we have today is, he has spent 64 billion pesos in mega structure, infrastructure.
Yeah, infrastructure projects.
Thank you very much. Yes. 60 billion in infrastructure. Now, meanwhile, what has been happening is between COVID and all these policies benefiting private sector, we are having 33% unemployment. 4.5 million people is not eating 3 meals per day. 500,000 people, small businesses are bankrupted. 4 million people lost their jobs, their employments last year. Over 70% of urban youth is unemployed, has no economic activity, is on the loop. So it's all this situation, and then he comes with a new tax reform, pretending and under the guise that this is going to benefit these impoverished and very affected people. And we understand, and everybody knows, from the top to the bottom, that what he is looking for is to benefit private sector industries, the mining and energy companies, and the banks. So this is why.
And also, I don't mean to interrupt you there, but that sort of ties into that privatization he wanted of the healthcare system as well, right?
Right. So that is the tax reform, but then next to that is the privatization of the health system, which is a health reform also that people in the health sector is protesting, and that's why yesterday health sector took the streets also. There is education reform that is also taking the education sector and students to the streets. There is a free prior consultation and consent, which is a fundamental right of Black and indigenous peoples under 169 ILO convention, that is also under reform and is going to impact collective rights, territorial rights, and the lives of ethnic groups here in Colombia. So there are several of reforms that he is pushing for that are going to just undermine completely the rights of people to provide this haven and this improvement of economic interest for the private sector, for the companies, for the banks, which is his main interest. So this is the whole thing boiling up that finally has like pushed people to the limits, to the point to be exposing ourselves with our lives to the bullets of the police on the streets.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It seems like it's sort of this fallacy or this falsely proposed altruistic or helpful policy on the outside, but how he's doing all these privatizations, especially of the healthcare industry and the other things that you're mentioning, it shows how false it all is.
Right. Let me just comment on this, because this is very important, because when there are tax reforms, right, what regularly people understand is that this is going to tax private sectors and the more rich to and the middle class, perhaps, to benefit the poor, right? Well, the problem in Colombia is that it's not taxing these sectors. It's actually taxing, it's actually preventing them from paying taxes and helping them, but also the middle class here basically doesn't exist. You know, there has been declared a middle class people that has minimum wage. You know, from minimum wage. You know, minimum wage here is $250 per month, and a rent for one person at that level cost 150. So, and then all these reforms that the government is providing are increasing food costs because of the different ways that these impact food production, because this is a government that imports food, doesn't help the agricultural sector, you know, the small agricultural sector. So that's why labor unions and just people, regular people, is coming to the streets, because this is very clearly, you know, something that is not going to benefit at all the main affected, impacted people in this country.
Definitely, it kind of sounds quite similar to in Russia, some of the tax reforms after the World Cup, where the elites and the aristocratic class were the only ones that benefited, and the poor were the ones that really suffered. I'd like to I think it's really important to understand sort of the nuance to this frustration. So let's go back to what you were talking about with these neoliberal policies being detrimental towards Afro-descendants and the indigenous community. I think you were mentioning also, especially in the mining industry, but where else is this prevalent and how?
Yes. Yeah, not only this government, you know, we have had an increasing interest since the tenure of former President Santos on the mining industry and the mining economy, you know, mining and energy economy. And I don't know if you can hear the helicopter overflowing. That's constantly here in Cali in the last, this month, it's like constantly. So, you know, indigenous and Afro-Descendant people are located, mostly Afro-Descendant people are located in areas where mining projects, national mining projects are focused, no, the main interests focus. I'm talking about Northern Cauca region, where 70% of those territories are under mining conceptions given by the government in violation of this free, prior, and informed consent that I mentioned before. And also illegal mining has been encroaching these territories, causing death and impoverishment and displacement and dispossession of people. And like the same way the other parts of the country in the south of the Pacific coast with the oil companies and pipes. So with the focus on this economic interest on mining and energy, since Santos government, right after the signing of the peace accord, there were some legislation that changes legislation that create significant threats to the collective rights of Black Afro-Descendant people, because some of these regulations were ignoring the needs, not only the territories that are already collectively titled, but ignoring the need to continue titling collective some of their territories. When there are no collective title, there is no way to protect those territories from these policies. So now with this government ignoring the peace accord, completely against the peace accord, and dismissing all the implementation of the peace accord, what we have in the Black territories is, on one side, the increase of armed groups, reorganized, mixed between paramilitary and narco-trafficking and other groups, reorganized, pushing for the displacement of people. So these mining companies, so these illegal mining groups, so these policies really can take place. So as Black people is living forcibly the territories, these policies come, right? And obviously this is under guise of development and producing benefits for people. But what kind of benefit people can have if it's pushed out of their territories to the cities to become unemployed and living on the streets and living on these sectors of impoverishment that today police have been shooting, right? So the negation of this government to follow up the peace accord has had a significant impact on Black Afro-Descendant people. As I say, 90% of the crimes against Afro-Descendant people have happened in this territory.
And sorry, just to stop you there, just to clarify what you're saying. So the current government's policy, which is against the peace accord, is causing the displacement of Black Afro-Descendants who happen to live in those areas where the conflict is. Is that right?
Yes, it's displacing people from these areas.
And then they're not given the benefit of, they're not helped after that displacement.
Oh no, there is no help. And there is no help. There is, the government put together some bonuses after COVID of 18,000 pesos. 18,000 pesos is less than $30, right? And who lives with $30 monthly? So when you are displaced from territories where you produce your food, where you have a certain level of sovereignty, economic and food sovereignty, to these peripheries of cities like Cali, to live under pieces of wood and plastic with 80,000 pesos, what is this, right? And why this happened? Because after 1991, the Constitution recognized the right for Black people to have collective rights of their lands. We have Law 70 signed in 1993 to provide this collective titling, right? We have 6 million hectares of land collective title, but now almost 70% of the displacement comes from those collective lands. So, meaning that as these are territories very rich on minerals, water, biogenetic and natural resources that these economic interests are focused on, people is displaced for those territories that have collective titles because the collective titles can protect those territories from the exploitation and the plunder from those policies. How is this displacement happen? By gun. So that is why during Duque's government, the armed groups have increased exponentially. And we are not talking just about FARC and ELN, the guerrilla groups. We are talking about paramilitaries linked to narco-traffic, linked to regular gangs and groups, right? Supported by police and military, and it's proven. That's not something that we just make up.
So why are they supported by the police and military?
Well, the history of this government of Duque is that it comes back off and supported by, you know, a former President Álvaro Uribe Vélez, which is the creator of paramilitary groups. You know, during his tenure, paramilitaries came to life. They were building up, and they came formally took over many areas of the country. Uribe gave them the benefit of the policy that apparently demobilized them, but then they continued growing, and then they reorganized with narco-traffic forces, because all this is supported by narco-traffic. And then now we have Duque, promoted by Uribe, supported by Uribe, and basically is on their interest that these groups take over territories where militarization is present. Police and especially military forces of the state are present in all these territories. And there's no way to explain when there is such a capacity, military capacity, that these groups continue growing up and continue to have total control of huge areas in the country, areas that are also increasing on coca crops, increasing on narco-traffic, and or also with all these resources that are of the economic interest of the country, of the state, and the multinationals.
So do you think with a more open and more positive peace agreement sort of policy, narco-trafficking would go down?
I'm sorry, ask that again?
From what I understood, you're saying that a lot of the narco-trafficking is because these paramilitary groups or whoever is linked to them has to fund their struggle against the government, for example.
Yeah, so the narco-traffic funds armed groups like paramilitaries and others. So that's one of the main. Narco-traffic has been the source of funding of militarization, being legal or illegal. And I'm putting in quotation marks legal because police and military are not legal anymore. They are in constant violation of constitution and human rights and international human rights policies. But is this money what really supports the military forces and militarization of this country, directly and indirectly? You cannot explain how it's possible that coca continues growing where, you know, the United States has invested over $15 billion on supporting Colombia to the war on drugs and the war against terrorism, apparently, right? And just with all this investment, right, that I also put in quotation marks, coca grows. Just after all this militarization that is educated and is trained by the US, that is impossible to have control of certain areas of this country, and these so-called illegal groups are in control. So for us, this is a government that is backed up by narco-traffic in one way or another. This is a government that is corrupt and criminal beyond any understanding. Being a right-wing, extreme right-wing government, right? We can understand why it's possible for forces like paramilitary to be taking over this country.
So what sort of, is there any vision for solutions to this systematic racism and government corruption? Are there any prosperous opposition leaders or opposition parties? Are there trade unions that show any hope? What's the sort of sentiment of hope amongst protesters of making a change?
Well, first of all, I have to clarify that there is a long way to go in this country to understand and be committed against racism. This is a country that still can't embrace the notion that it's a racist country. And this is important to understand it because, especially in Black Afro-Descendant territories, some of the reasons that we are disproportionately impacted by this work-like kind of situation is because racism, is because the hundreds of years of being completely invisible and discriminated against and excluded. Now, saying that, there are a strong opposition, certainly, to these neoliberal policies and this right-wing government. So, labor unions are opposed, so-called left parties are opposed, and indigenous.
Is there some hope in the election process? Because I know that historically the Colombian election process has been under scrutiny for quite a lot of corruption, right? Do
Yes.
people feel like they can change the government fairly in an election? Or?
Well, here is the thing. Ivan Duque was elected under tremendous pressure of armed groups. As I said before, mostly these old paramilitary narco-traffic groups. So when people criticize that you elect this president, I didn't elect this president, Some people that is benefit, from a right-wing government, and is right-wing perhaps, what is benefit, and those elections happened under the gun, right? So he was elected.
So you mean that people were sort of physically pressured to vote for him? So it's the civilians that were pressured to vote for him by violence.
People who was opposed, and the parties that were opposing in contesting the elections with their own candidates, particularly from the left, will have little chance in areas where they are more favor, have more favor of the voters, because those areas were completely controlled by armed groups. So it's understandable that right-wing voters will vote, and the rest will be having hard time voting. That's one thing. There has been also charges for corruption on that process. So that's one thing, right? Is how this government came into place, no? And then I think I lost the initial point of your question, but if you remind me to don't lose the point. But this is the thing I wanted first of all to mention.
What sort of hope there is to change the government, maybe for a more socialist or
right.
egalitarian sort of party or reform?
Right. So what we have now, and this government has managed to get, is that people lost fear, right? This is a country that has been living under the terror of the imposition of violence. And finally, people is like, we have enough. If they are going to kill us, they are going to kill us, but we are going to, we don't continue under this situation. It's like most people that have nothing else to lose. And especially young people has nothing else to lose. I mentioned 70% of urban youth had nothing to do, has no income, has no education, they don't have access to health. And they are under constant threat. You know, we in our territories had 3 massacres last year where 17 people in a very small area were killed, youth, between 13 and 17-year-old people. This says a lot, and now we have 90 people. We just did a report where 90 people, youth people between 15 and 30 years, were killed last year. Black people. So this is people with no hope. Youth has no hope. So right now is a more hopeful, I will say, sounding contradictory here, but it's like there are different conditions now that can say that perhaps we will overcome this fear and come to the streets and vote when the time comes, or do something, right? But I certainly believe, and many of us believe, that there is going to be some kind of transformation. Now, what we are facing right now, right? This government, Duque right now, is pushing for and pushing civil society to get in a situation that where he can call for a state of emergency. And a state of emergency, that is to put militaries on control. And like we have no militarized already, so it's just officially, because this is happening already, this country is under military control and in command. Now, officially, he can declare this, or it can be declared. What is going to happen is that the brutalization of this repression is going to escalate, right? So now, what you saw for Cali, and you have seen in several cities, these numbers that you mentioned initially are going to exponentially grow in rural areas, because this is going to escalate to rural areas. This is, for us as Black people, a premonitory message that says, be aware that all this violence that is happening right now in Cali and Medellin and Bogota is going to mobilize to the rural areas, where we, as Black and indigenous people, have to be in the need to stand up to defend territorial rights from these policies and from militarization, because we are completely opposed to militarization, being legal or illegal, state or non-state, right? And to exercise our free determination and sovereignty of these collective lands, we are going to have to stand up and be exposed to the violence and the criminal attacks of this government. This is what we are facing.
Yeah, it sounds like people have been pushed as far as they can into a corner, and now you can't push them anymore, so they have to fight back, right?
Yes, and just to complete the response to your question, you know, right now there are coalitions of different politicians to find out like
You just broke up a little bit there. Could you please repeat that, Charo?
okay, right. Right now there is a coalition of different politicians from the left and some sectors that oppose this right-wing government, coming together to propose and to find ways to bring one single candidate that everybody can kind of agree with. We also have Francia Marquez as campaigning as a candidate for president of the country, that also is bringing together many other forces and people, you know, common people that is interested in changing this situation. So here is some level of hope in these positions, right? And what I say is people is ready to make a change. People is ready to look for something different.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do this interview was because of the internet shutdowns that the government have been implementing lately, which for me is extremely concerning, because it's never good when you see government shutting down the internet, because it shows that they're trying to hide mostly human rights abuses in the streets from the police or from the government against local civilians. So can you talk to us a little bit about these internet shutdowns and then the restriction that the government and the police are trying to put on people from expressing and showing the world what's happening?
Oh, okay, so you could off a little bit, but I got it. So you are asking me about the cut off of communications and right, the access.
Exactly, the deleting of the Instagram videos, blocking of the internet, etc.
Well, you know, this is I mean, silence and visibility.
Because historically it's always a terrible thing. Like, let's look at Myanmar, for example, when the government recently shut down Facebook and the internet.
Exactly. So, you know, this is the tendency of these right-wing and extreme governments that always look to silence people, right? And silence the media. Well, not that we have really a reliable media here, but as social media become an instrument so important for civil society to show up what is going on, and as possible to see and Google everywhere now, you can see all what the police was doing. Obviously, the decision of shutting down different social media sources is first step, right? And as I was going to say, silence and invisibility is what allows governments like this to become regimes that are protected by this kind of shadow or umbrella of like things like the peace accord. You know, for us, as the peace accord was important to have it, it become also an issue when people say, "Oh, you don't have human rights issues because you have a peace accord," right? Because nothing is shown.
Like a distraction from the real nuance.
Exactly, as a distraction. It doesn't help to us that Colombia is the main ally of the United States, who wants to impose, you know, these imperialist and militaristic policies and actions against all around the globe, right? And particularly in this region, it doesn't help that they are supporting this government, ignoring, pretending that they don't know and don't hear. Well, you know, Trump was one thing, but before Trump, happened the same with Obama. And right now we have to see with Biden what positions he takes, because they continue to give money to this government despite all the reports and the proofs that we show to them that this government completely violates human rights in this country, right? So when there is that kind of support and there is this kind of distraction showing that Colombia, or for instance, showing that Colombia it has increased economically and that there is development growing up in this country, and then they don't show what is the cost of that development and that growth, and who is really being served of this process and who isn't, then this is what happens. So that's why has to be shut it down, and preventing that information comes out and the information is presented. So this kind of conversations is very important for us, and the reason I take time over the scheduled agenda I always have to talk to you is because these are other ways to bring out this information, to make sure that people understand that what is happening here, and also mobilize governments and mobilize civil society and mobilize opinion about this situation, because silence is as criminal as assassin as someone shooting you directly, pointing at you and shooting. So yeah, that's it. That's what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Two things. Could you just explain any more of the human rights abuses or examples of human rights abuses that have gone on recently? And then also, what has been the reaction by institutions like the UN on human rights abuses? Are they being informed about this? Have they had an active role? Are they showing any prosperity of making any international crime charges?
Well, as I have mentioned, I have make a significant number of mentions to human rights abuses, like the criminalization of the protests, the criminalization of human rights. I think that just the fact of being ignoring the significant and severe situation of human rights in this country is by itself a human rights violation and situation. 50% of the crimes against social leaders globally coming from this country is a lot to say, right? So there is
50% in the whole world.
In the whole world,
in
right?
Colombia.
Yeah, those are UN international bodies information. From the whole world, all the actions. There's over 900 cases documented, or something, 990 cases documented. 50% comes from this country. So when everybody's talking about Cuba, Venezuela, and others, they don't talk about Colombia. 50% of those. So that is, and what is that? Is killings, is criminalization, the judicialization of human rights defenders. Most people that have been defending the rights to land and territorial rights, environmentalists, are military target in this country, and then women. As women have been standing up to defend not just women's rights, but the right to live, the youth, we are becoming military target also. And by who? By the forces supported and backed up by this government. What other human rights violations? The right to food, the right to water, the right to health. During COVID, most of our territories, indigenous and Afro-Descendant territories, most of these impoverished communities that they are shooting today didn't have a hospital, a special unit to treat people with COVID. Most of the Black people here were extremely vulnerable to COVID. And we gathered some information that say that 40% of Black people didn't have access to the test. And so those kind of situations are human rights violations in this country. Those policies that have been imposed, you know, making more rich the rich and more impoverished the poor, are human rights violations. The environment impacted by this mining and these energy policies are human rights violations. And the imposition of all these policies in this country are human rights violations because it affects economic sovereignty, food sovereignty, and are affecting severely the health of people. I don't have the numbers right now, but people are killing themselves. What's the name of that?
Suicide?
Suicide.
Suicide.
Thank you. I mean, the numbers of suicide are increasing exponentially, and youth people are killing themselves. And this is not because, as in the United States, for instance, they are subject of bullying. No, it is because, you know, 17% of the youth in this country had no health, education, jobs, nothing, right? And the better option that they have is forced recruitment to be part of military forces, legal or illegal. And many are not interested on that. So this is a country that lives under severe human rights violations.
Yeah, that's interesting what you're saying about how a lot of the youth are joining these paramilitary organizations just because they don't have any other economic opportunities. It's the similar case in actually some African countries with terrorism. A lot of the people who are fighting in those terrorist groups, like Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab, are not even radicalized. They just have no economic opportunities due to this inequality. So it seems like the inequality between the rich and the poor is really the crux of where to start in giving people more opportunities, right?
Right, and this is very important also because this is linked to displacement and immigration, right? Here, for instance, we are interested on investigating displacement of the youth and families to prevent this recruitment, because not only the illegal armed groups, but also military and police try to recruit Black people. And people doesn't want their children, you know, as you will say, we are not bringing children to the war. So in this context of war, we don't want our children joining any armed group at all. And this is generating significant displacement of families. And the same as you mentioned in Africa and other countries where people have to emigrate to prevent this situation, right? So it's very important for everybody to understand the connections between the different situations that people are suffering in the war, particularly Black and African people. Also, I think that calling the attention on what happens on Haiti is very, very important for that reason, because many of these different things I have mentioned here are connected to all these other situations happening in areas where people are subject to war conditions and impoverishment conditions because of these capitalist policies and imposition of militarized policies also.
Okay, thanks so much for today, Charo. Finally, what can people outside of Colombia do to help? Just briefly, what can people outside the country do to help?
Well, the first help is to help to bring out this understanding of the situation. You know, is as more people educated these people about what is happening, more things can, better things can come out of this, especially the support from the international community to all of us that are opposing to this situation and become military targets of this government. But other things that are important is to call for the recognition and implementation of the peace accord and the ethnic chapter, because you know this is not the best accord in the world. We don't think that this is going to solve anything, everything at all at once, right? But it's very important. Some things are very important and provide you know, a little base for changes. One of those is the whole system of truth, reparation, no repetition that is in place. And is one of the reasons why this government is so opposed, because it's going to bring the truth about Alvaro Uribe, about the military involved on extrajudicial killings, about the companies involved on supporting paramilitary forces. So going with this is very important, and it's very important that people call the attention on this. You ask about the UN. UN has been in many ways very outspoken and very supported and you know, getting information, etc. This is a government that don't care whatsoever what UN has to say or has to do, right? They have turned the back completely to the UN here. They have turned the back here to the countries that are supporting and are the guarantors of the peace accord, for instance, like Norway. They don't receive anybody. They don't talk to anybody. They don't. They are just there, you know, on their own. The only people they talk to is economic forces and the United States. Nothing else. So peace accord and call back to a human rights situation, you know, and make sure that there is a reinforcement of the messages about the violations of human rights in this country is another. And I think that, you know, COVID may not facilitate this, but we need to organize investigations here on these human rights violations. And human rights organizations, organizations like mine, the indigenous, the women's organizations that carry out these investigations and document cases, we are going to need significant support, because we cannot depend from international cooperation that is no that doesn't take sides, right? What is the word for that when people take or don't take sides? Is
like polarization or partisanship or polarization.
Right, but there is another word for this that I can't remember right now.
Conflict.
They are no. Anyway, we need autonomous resources. We need autonomy to do these investigations, and we need autonomy and autonomous investigations on this human rights situation, because authorities
like
are
a third party, an impartial party doing these investigations.
Thanks. Impartial was the word I was looking for. So we don't need, you know, impartial investigations. We need autonomy to do these investigations, because we cannot rely on government investigations and certain institutions' investigations. We can't even rely completely on UN investigations when they cannot provide direct information sometimes, because they have to keep certain rules of, you know, and it doesn't help sometimes, and this government doesn't listen anyway. So that support, you know, of people to organizations and grassroots organizations, so we don't depend on these other resources to carry out investigations, and the work that we need to do is also very important. And for that, you know, there are many organizations that have websites and things that you can go and look and just decide who you want to support. But it's very important that we get that kind of support, and continuously be demanding from the countries that support this peace agreement and support economically by having economic agreements and relationships with Colombia to look after how this country is carrying out the human rights situation. Because countries should stop economic relationships with Colombia until this government proves that effectively is respecting the human rights of its people.
So you think an economic boycott or a trade embargo or something along those lines from the international community, putting sanctions on the government could change?
Exactly. I think you are in Barcelona. In Barcelona, there is a very important mobilization and position from companies that have economic activities in Buenaventura, in the port of Buenaventura, precisely following up on these the human rights situations in Buenaventura, and they have stopped relations, and they have called for human rights respect, and they have support on the ground investigations and those things to ensure that that port doesn't grow on blood that they are financing. So that kind of action and response is very, very important, that civil society promotes with economic companies and groups. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Charo. Was there anything else that you wanted to say before we get going?
No. I think I have said a lot. I may have a lot more to say, but I also have to go. But I thank you very much, and I hope that many people can really reach a good lot of this information. I want to perhaps share with you some links and other things on email.
Absolutely, yes. And
get more information on Peace Accord, on Black and Indigenous people and women, and send you our reports. Are mostly in Spanish, but you know, I can send them to you.
Absolutely, yeah. Send them through, and we'll do everything we can to spread the message. And yeah, hopefully there's a positive change.